Hi, this video looks at how we can judge the impact of internationalisation on the people, the human resources function within a business. It's always worth thinking about before we start thinking, well, how will internationalisation affect a functional area? Well, how do we actually judge how effective a functional area is? How do we judge their performance? So just take a minute to write down as many ways as you can think of that you can measure the performance of the human resources function in a business. Maybe pause the video here. So hopefully you'll have got some of these, and what we're thinking about is, okay, if we are conducting some of our production overseas, how might that affect labour turnover? How might it affect employee costs as a percentage of our turnover? How could it affect the motivation of staff within a business? And so there are a number of factors that a business needs to consider from the HR point of view. Perhaps the most important is culture. I won't go into a huge amount of detail on this in this video because we're going to be looking at this a lot more in Unit 10, but Hofstede came up, he was a Dutch researcher who worked with IBM, I think in the 1970s, and he came up with, he looked at IBM, and they're a big international organisation operating across a load of different countries, and he conducted research basically, and he found a number of different dimensions of culture. I won't go into loads of detail, but essentially, as you are well aware as people who live often outside your home country, different countries have different cultures, that things are done differently, and you'd manage a worker who grew up in India very differently to a worker who grew up in the UK. I'll just give you one example here, the power distance. In the UK and the USA and Australia, it's acceptable to question your manager's kind of point of view, and it's kind of seen as a normal part of work. Managers should justify why they're doing something often to people. Whereas in India, that would be completely unheard of, completely disrespectful for you to question your manager. So generally, you wouldn't do it. So being aware of different cultures is really, really important when you're operating with a workforce that's full of multinational people. So you manage those people in the correct way, and obviously that applies to customers too. Other issues to do with internationalisation. So a story here about how Prudential workers, Prudential are an insurance company, a finance company in the UK, they went on strike after the firm's plan to move jobs abroad. Of course, internationalisation can have huge impact on industrial relations, number of strike days taken, the relationship with the workforce in one country. If if people are losing jobs in one country because they're being outsourced to another, or offshored, I should say, to another. Communication within the company becomes far more difficult. We're dealing with different languages, cultures, time zones. Communication can become a real issue. And finally, on this slide is issues to do with employee rights, working hours, employment laws. How do you pay people in different countries? How there's a whole load of things you need to get your head around as the Human Resources Department from operating overseas that are important for the management of your staff. Diseconomies of scale is a good way to illustrate this. Economies of scale occur that the more we produce, the greater the quantity of our output. You can see that average costs start to fall, but we know that eventually diseconomies of scale will start to set in, and actually average costs start to rise again. So economies of scale are how, as we increase the size of our production, average costs fall. Well, by the time we get to Q4, we're experiencing increasing average costs again. Our average costs are rising, and this is a lot to do with the people function. Different diseconomies of scale. Number one, communication. The bigger an organisation is, the more difficult, the more costly it is to communicate with all of the people across that organisation. It takes time and effort to make sure everyone's understood it. This leads to coordination problems, and this is a particular problem when you're trying to manage a workforce that's across, different continents, different time zones. As the workforce gets larger, communication is going to become more difficult. Maybe we need to change the structure. We need to put more structures, more layers in the hierarchy to kind of monitor. We've seen that with kind of Griner's model of growth, where we get to a certain point and we need to get rid of that flexibility that we had as a small company, and as a larger company we need to do more monitoring of kind of making sure messages are getting through and are being implemented. Finally, the motivation of staff can suffer as we expand overseas, because communication, coordination becomes more difficult, we're becoming more centralised, employees feel demotivated, feel like a small cog in a large machine, and this can be a real issue as we grow internationally.